The morning they forced Sodbello to marry a beggar. She was 17 years old. She stood at the entrance of a dusty compound, wearing a borrowed wrapper that was 2 sizes too large and sandals that pinched her feet at the toes. Around her, relatives she barely knew filled the compound with noise and laughter. Some of them had not visited in years. They had come today not out of love, but out of curiosity, to see what kind of man her uncle had found for her. And then they saw him. He sat on a low stool near the gate, a man somewhere in his 30s with rough, worn clothes hanging loosely off his frame. His sandals were broken at the left strap, held together with a strip of black polythene. His face was unshaven. His hands rested on his knees, and those hands were calloused and darkened from years of something the compound could not name. He had arrived alone. No family, no witnesses, no fanfare. Just himself and the small bundle of cloth that sat at his feet. The compound fell into a strange quiet. Then the laughter started. "Look at what Baba Kunnal has brought for this poor girl." Someone said loudly, "Is this a husband or a patient?" More laughter. Some of the women covered their mouths. Some did not bother. In the middle of it all, Sodbello stood very still. She did not look at the man. She looked at the sky above the compound. Cloudless, pale blue, indifferent. She had learned in her 17 years that the sky at least was honest. It never pretended to be something it was not. She did not know yet that the man on the stool was the same. Sod had been alone in the world since she was 11 years old. Her parents, Rashid and Folake Bello, had been teachers in a public school in Abeokuta. They were not wealthy people, but they were good ones. Their home was small and honest. There were books on a shelf above the television. There was always food on the table even if it was simple. Her father told stories in the evening after dinner. Her mother sang while she swept the compound on Saturday mornings. Then one Harmattan night, a fire started in the kitchen while Sod slept. She woke to smoke, and the sound of her mother screaming her name. By the time the neighbors broke down the door, the kitchen had taken the back of the house. Her father got Sod out through the window. He went back for her mother. He did not come back out. Sod was 11 years old when she watched the firemen pull 2 bodies from the ruins of the home where she had learned to read. After the burial, she was sent to live with her father's younger brother, Uncle Kunnal Bello, in a crowded part of Abeokuta where the streets were narrow and the houses pressed against each other like people in a queue. Uncle Kunnal was a man of small income and large appetites. He drank in the evenings and spent the weekends arguing with neighbors. His wife, Auntie Remy, was a market woman who returned home tired and sharp-tongued every night. They did not want Sod. They had 3 children of their own, and a house that was already too small. But they took her because the church said family must not abandon family, and because her parents had left behind a small plot of land in the village that Uncle Kunnal believed he could access once he became Sada's legal guardian. From the first week, Sod understood her position in the house. She woke at 5 every morning to sweep the compound and fetch water before Uncle Kunnal's children woke up. She washed clothes by hand in a blue plastic basin behind the house. She cooked breakfast, washed dishes, and then walked 40 minutes to the public school where she was enrolled not because they wanted her educated, but because the government would ask questions if she was not. At school she was quiet and attentive. She sat near the window and listened to her teachers with the hunger of someone who understood that learning was the only thing in her life no one could take away. Her teachers noticed her. Madam Adeyemi, who taught English, sometimes kept her after class to lend her books. "You are a sharp girl," Madam Adeyemi told her once. "Don't let this place swallow you." Sod held those words like a stone in her pocket, something solid to press her hand against when everything else felt like water. At home, Auntie Remy found fault with everything she did. The soup was too light. The compound was not swept properly. She walked too slowly, spent too long at the well, talked back when she had not said a word. Uncle Kunnal did not beat her. He simply did not see her. She moved through his house like furniture he had inherited and could not quite find a use for. She turned 15, then 16. She grew taller and quieter. She learned to make herself small in rooms where she was not wanted. She learned to finish her work before anyone noticed it needed doing. She learned to carry hunger past the point where it hurt and into the place where it simply was. But she also kept reading. Every book Madam Adeyemi lent her. Every newspaper she found discarded at the market. Every notice board she passed on the way to school. Words were the only territory she could claim entirely as her own. When she turned 17, Uncle Cunnel called her into the parlor one evening. She stood before him with her hands at her sides. He sat in the large chair he always occupied, the one positioned to suggest authority. Auntie Remy sat nearby pretending to sort groundnuts. "We have found a husband for you," Uncle Cunnel said. Sod looked at him carefully. She did not speak. "A man has approached me," he continued. "He is a serious man. Responsible. He has agreed to marry you and take you off our hands." Off our hands. The phrase landed in the room like an object dropped on a tiled floor. "Who is he?" Sod asked. Uncle Cunnel shifted slightly in his chair. "He is someone I know from the area. He has had some difficulties in life. He is currently without permanent work." Sod waited. She already knew there was more. "He stays near the motor park sometimes," Uncle Cunnel added quickly. "But he is a good man. Honest." Auntie Remy did not look up from the groundnuts. But the corner of her mouth moved. Sod understood then. They had found her a beggar. A man who slept near the motor park. A man who was as invisible to the world as she was, with the difference that the world at least occasionally gave her a classroom to sit in. She thought about arguing. She thought about the words she had been collecting for years, the language of rights, of dignity, of a life that belonged to her. She thought about Madame Adeyemi who had told her not to let this place swallow her. Then she looked at Uncle Cunnel, at the way he sat with the confidence of a man who had already decided, at Auntie Remy's small cold smile. She thought about the plot of land in the village, about what Uncle Cunnel would do once she was gone, and there was no one left to ask questions on her behalf. She was 17 years old, alone in a house where she was not wanted, with no money, no family, and nowhere to go. She lifted her chin very slightly. "When?" she asked. Uncle Cunnel blinked. He had expected resistance. Perhaps tears. When she gave him neither, something in his expression flickered. Not guilt, but something adjacent to it. "Next Saturday," he said. Sod nodded once. She turned and walked back to the small room where she slept on a mat beside the window. She sat down on the mat in the dark. Outside, she could hear Auntie Remy's children watching television in the next room. She did not cry. She had used up her tears years ago, standing outside a burning house at 11 years old. Instead, she did what she always did when the world pressed down on her. She thought. The man's name was Adewale Ogundamu. He was 36 years old. That was all Uncle Cunnel told her before the wedding day. She saw him for the first time on the morning of the ceremony when the compound filled with relatives, and the relatives filled with noise. He was sitting on the low stool near the gate, as still as something that had been placed there rather than something that had chosen to sit. Up close, he was different from what she had built in her imagination. Not frightening. Not broken in the way she expected a man who slept near the motor park to look. His eyes were calm, deeply calm, the kind of calm that was not emptiness, but something much more deliberate. His clothes were poor, yes. His sandals were held together with polythene. But he sat with his back straight and his hands still, and he did not look at the people who were laughing at him. He looked at her. When their eyes met, he did not look away. He did not smile. He did not perform anything. He simply looked at her the way you look at something you're taking seriously. The ceremony was brief and without celebration. An elderly neighbor read a short prayer. Uncle Cunnel and two of his relatives signed a paper. Auntie Remy served small chin-chin in a bowl that no one really ate. When it was done, Adewale stood up slowly and picked up his small bundle of cloth. He looked at Sod. "Are you ready?" he asked. His voice was quiet and unhurried. The question surprised her. She had expected to be told, not asked. "Yes," she said. They walked out of the compound together. The laughter behind them faded into the street noise of Abeokuta. "Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and what time is it there right now? And if stories like this move something in you, please subscribe. You will not want to miss how this ends." Adewale's home was not what the compound had led Sod to imagine. She had pictured a place under a bridge. A piece of cardboard. A plastic sheet stretched between two poles. She had prepared herself for the absolute bottom of things. Because when you have already survived a fire and 6 years in your uncle's house, you learn to prepare for the worst and be grateful when it is merely bad. What she found instead was a small room in a face-me-I-face-you compound in a quiet street behind the Kudo market. The room was plain, cement floor, a window with a metal louve, a thin mattress on a wooden bed frame, a small table, a plastic chair. But the room was clean. Swept. There was a kerosene lantern on the table, and a small metal pot on a gas ring in the corner. It was the room of someone who had very little but chose to keep what they had with care. Adewale set his bundle down inside the door and turned to her. "Sit anywhere you want," he said. "This is your home now." Saad looked around the small room. She looked at the one chair and the edge of the bed and the small stool near the window. She chose the stool because it was closest to the outside air. She sat. He sat on the plastic chair. For a few minutes neither of them spoke. Outside, the compound was quiet. A woman singing somewhere, a radio playing faintly, a child's footsteps running past the door. Then Saad asked the question that had been sitting in her chest since the morning. "Why did you agree to marry me?" she asked. She kept her voice flat. She was not asking with hope. She was asking with the precision of someone who needed accurate information. Adewale looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Because your uncle came to me, and I could see from the way he spoke about you that no one in that house was protecting you," he said. He paused. "I cannot give you much, but I will not put you in danger." Saad studied him. He did not look like a man performing a speech. He looked like a man saying a plain thing. "Where do you sleep?" she asked. "Before today. Sometimes here," he said. "Sometimes elsewhere. I move around." "Are you really a beggar?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have asked people for things when I needed them. Does that make me a beggar?" She did not know how to answer that. So she said nothing. He stood. "I will sleep on the floor," he said simply. "You take the bed." She started to protest. He shook his head once. "You are 17, and you've been on a mat for 6 years. Sleep on the bed." She looked at him. Then she lay down on the thin mattress. It was the first bed she had slept in since she was 11 years old. She stared at the ceiling for a long time before sleep came. But it did come. And when it did, it was the deepest sleep she had known in years. The days that followed were strange in ways Saad had not expected. Strange not because they were painful, she was accustomed to pain, but because they were not. Because Adewale was not what the word beggar had made her imagine. He woke early, earlier even than she did. By the time she opened her eyes, he was already outside. She could hear him moving in the compound, quietly, efficiently, the way someone moves when they do not want to disturb the world. When she came out, there was sometimes water already fetched in the bucket beside the door. Sometimes there was a small bread roll wrapped in paper from a stall at the end of the street. He did not explain these things. He simply left them. She began to notice other things. The way he spoke to the compound neighbors. Careful, respectful, brief. The way he read. She discovered this on the third morning when she came outside before he expected her, and found him sitting near the compound entrance with a folded newspaper, reading with the concentration of someone who reads not to pass time but to know something. "What is that?" she asked. "Business news," he said, without looking up. "The port levy has changed. It will affect import prices by next quarter." She stared at him. He was wearing his broken sandal and a faded shirt. He was reading about import prices and port levies. He finally looked up and saw her expression. "Old habit," he said simply. She sat down beside him. She did not ask more. But she watched. Over the following days, people came to the compound to see Adewale. Not beggars. Not neighbors borrowing salt. The first one came on a Tuesday. A man in a clean but simple shirt and plain trousers, carrying a small briefcase. He greeted Adewale with 2 hands and a slight forward tilt of the head that Saad had only ever seen people give to someone they respected. They spoke quietly near the compound gate. Adewale reviewed something in the briefcase, papers, and spoke in a low voice. The man nodded several times, wrote something down, and left. Adewale came back inside as if nothing had happened. "Who was that?" Saad asked. "Someone I work with sometimes," he said. "What kind of work?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "I will explain everything," he said. "But not yet. Are you hungry?" She was. He went out and returned with fried yam and pepper sauce wrapped in newspaper. They ate together on the stool and the plastic chair. She let the question sit. She had learned patience in harder places than this. The second visitor came on Thursday. This one wore a suit. Not an expensive suit, but a real one, properly pressed. He arrived in a small car, parked outside the compound, and walked in looking slightly out of place among the Face Me I Face You buildings. He found Adewale in the compound, and they spoke for nearly 20 minutes. At one point Adewale laughed, a short, quiet, genuine laugh, and the suited man laughed too. Saad watched from the doorway. When the man left, Adewale turned and found her watching. He held her gaze for a moment. Soon, he said. I will tell you soon. She raised an eyebrow. That is what you said on Tuesday. I know, he said. He almost smiled. I am keeping my word about the soon part. She shook her head and went back inside. But something in her chest had shifted slightly. She could not name it yet. She only knew it was different from the feeling of dread she had carried since the morning she left Uncle Cunnell's compound. It was closer to curiosity. News of the marriage had reached back to the relatives quickly, as news always does. And the verdict was unanimous. That poor child. Married to a beggar at 17. Her parents would weep. At the market where Auntie Remy sold her goods, the women of the area had much to say. Uncle Cunnell did that girl a great injustice, one trader said. Another sucked her teeth. He used that child to clear debt or something. The man they married her to sleeps at the motor park. A third woman, younger, shook her head. She was a sharp student too. Madame Adeyemi at the school was always talking about her. The gossip reached Madame Adeyemi herself by the end of that first week. The teacher stood in her classroom after the students had left and felt the weight of it land on her chest. She thought about the girl with the quiet eyes who read everything she was given. She thought about the words she had spoken, "Don't let this place swallow you," and wondered if she had been too late even then. She decided she would find a way to check on Saad. Meanwhile, in the small room behind Kudo Market, life was building itself in ways Saad had not planned for. She and Adewale had developed a rhythm. He left early in the morning for reasons she had stopped pressing him about. She used the time alone in the room to read. Had books, a small stack of them in the corner behind the table, and she had moved through all of them within the first 2 weeks. Business textbooks, an economics primer, 2 novels, a thick worn book on Nigerian land law. When he came back each evening, they ate together, and sometimes talked. She told him about her parents. He listened in the way people rarely listen, without preparing his own story while she told hers, without offering comfort before she had finished. He simply received what she said. He told her very little about himself in those early weeks. But he asked her questions. What did she want to do with her life? What subjects she was strongest in? Whether she had ever thought about continuing her education. No one had asked her these questions before. She told him she wanted to study law. The Nigerian land law book had come alive in her hands like a conversation she had always wanted to have. She wanted to understand who owned what, and why and how people lost things they should not have lost. She was thinking about her parents' land. About what Uncle Cunnell was planning to do with it. Adewale listened without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded slowly. That is a good choice, he said. She looked at him. It is not a choice yet, she said. It is just a want. He looked at her across the small table. Wants become choices when you decide they will, he said. Start deciding. She pressed her lips together. That is easy to say. Yes, he replied. Most true things are. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she went back to the land law book. A dog barked loudly somewhere in the compound, and she lost her place on the page. She paused. She found the line again, adjusted the book slightly toward the window light, and continued reading. Adewale said nothing, but he was watching. And something in the way she did it, the pause, the adjustment, the continuation without complaint, settled something in his chest that he had not expected to feel settled. 3 weeks after the wedding, 2 things happened on the same day. The first was that Madame Adeyemi came to the compound. She arrived in the afternoon, wearing a teacher's blouse and a plain wrapper, carrying a small bag. She asked for Saad at the compound entrance. When Saad appeared at the door, Madame Adeyemi looked at her for a long moment. Taking in the simple wrapper, the small room visible behind her, the man sitting near the compound gate reading his newspaper. She hugged Saad tightly. I looked for you, she said. Saad felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was tight. They sat inside the room and talked for over an hour. Madame Adeyemi asked everything. How she was being treated, whether she was safe, whether she was eating. Saad answered honestly. Yes, yes, yes. Madame Adeyemi looked surprised. She had prepared herself for something worse. He is not what people say, Saad told her quietly. Madame Adeyemi looked toward the compound gate where Adewale was visible, still reading. There is something unusual about that man, she said slowly. I cannot place it. Neither can I, Saad said. But I am trying. Before she left, Madame Adeyemi reached into her bag and pulled out 2 things. A notebook and a pen. And a folded application form. This is for the evening school program at the Polytechnic, she said. You are old enough to apply. If you fill this and bring it to me, I will help you with the rest. Saad took the form with both hands. That was the first thing. The second thing happened an hour after Madame Adeyemi left. A convoy of 3 cars drove slowly into the street outside the compound. Not large cars. Not the SUVs of politicians, but good, clean, clearly expensive cars. They stopped outside. Several men in shirts and trousers stepped out, moving with the efficient deference of people who worked for someone important. The last car door opened. A woman stepped out. She was in her 60s, with the bearing of someone who had commanded rooms for decades. She wore a simple but clearly expensive Ankara blouse and a head wrap tied with quiet authority. She looked at the compound entrance. Then she looked at Adewale, who had stood up from his stool when he heard the cars. Something passed between them, recognition, but complicated. The kind of recognition that carries history inside it. Adewale's expression shifted. For the first time since Saad had met him, she saw something in his face that was not stillness. It was resistance. "Mama," he said. His voice was low. The woman, his mother, looked at him for a long, wordless moment. Then her eyes moved to Saad standing in the doorway. She studied Saad the way Adewale had studied her on the morning of the wedding. Carefully, without cruelty, taking something in. Then she looked back at her son. "How long?" she said. That was all she said. Adewale's jaw tightened. "Long enough." His mother nodded once, slowly. Then she said something that made everyone in the compound go completely still. "The board is calling for you," she said quietly. "They cannot hold the situation much longer. Funmaleo has been making moves. If you do not return, she will take it." Adewale closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, Saad was watching him. He looked at her. His expression said, "I owe you the truth, and I am about to give it to you. Come inside," he said to his mother. The room was too small for 3 people, and the weight of what was about to be said. Adewale stood near the window. His mother sat in the plastic chair. Saad sat on the edge of the bed. A long silence. Then Adewale spoke. And the story he told changed everything Saad thought she knew about the man she had married. His full name was Adewale Ogundamu, son of Alhaja Bintu Ogundamu, chairman of Ogundamu Holdings, a private conglomerate with interests in real estate, logistics, and agribusiness across 5 states. A man whose name opened certain doors in Lagos and Abuja, in ways that his current sandals and broken compound existence had been designed to conceal. 3 years ago, he had walked away. Not from his wealth. His wealth was still intact, held in a trust managed by his mother and a board of directors. But from the life attached to it. From the board meetings and the socialites and the women who recalibrated their warmth based on the latest report from his accountant. From Funmaleo, the woman his family had been grooming as his partner. A woman of impeccable connections and cold calculation who made no distinction between loving Adewale and accessing Adewale's balance sheet. He had walked away after his closest friend and business partner died in a road accident, and the first call Adewale received was not one of condolence, but one asking about the status of a contract his late friend had been managing. That day, something in Adewale Ogundamu decided it was finished. He told his mother he needed time. He took nothing except his name and a small amount of cash he did not touch after the first month. He found the room behind Kudo Market. He paid his rent in cash delivered through a third party. He lived as the world believed him, as a man who had nothing. He had spent 3 years watching people, watching how the world treated a man with broken sandals. And he had learned, in those 3 years, more about human nature than any boardroom had ever taught him. Saad sat on the edge of the bed and listened to all of it. When he finished, the room was very quiet. She looked at him for a long time. "You are a billionaire," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at her hands in her lap. The Polytechnic application form was still folded in her pocket. She could feel it there. "You married me," she said. "Yes." "Why me specifically?" she asked. "Uncle Kunal did not know who you were." "No," Adewale said. "He did not. But I had seen you. 3 weeks before your uncle came to me, I had been at the motor park when you walked past on your way from school. You were carrying 3 textbooks and a bag that was clearly too heavy. A man on a motorcycle drove through a puddle and soaked your uniform. He did not stop. You looked at the mud on your clothes for one moment. Then you adjusted the books on your arm and kept walking." Saad stared at him. "I saw that," he said. "And I thought, this person does not wait for the world to apologize to her. She simply continues." The room was silent. His mother was watching Saad with a different expression now. Something measuring had softened into something else. Then Saad asked the question she most needed answered. "Did you know about the land?" She said, "My parents' land that my uncle is trying to take." Adewale looked at her. Yes, he said. I found out the week after the wedding. I've already had someone begin the legal process to protect it in your name. Something moved across Sada's face. Not tears. She had told herself she was done with tears. But something that was the feeling behind tears. Something cracking open in a way that did not hurt. She pressed her lips together and looked at the window. Her parents' land. Protected. In her name. Outside, the evening was beginning to fall over Abeokuta. The compound was quiet. Someone was cooking groundnut soup. She could smell it drifting through the window. She turned back to Adewale. You should have told me, she said. Yes, he said. I should have. I am sorry. I am not a test, she said. Her voice was quiet but certain. I know. He held her gaze. You are the most honest person I have met in 3 years. And I handled honesty with fear. That was wrong. She nodded. It was. His mother was watching both of them with the expression of a woman witnessing something she had not expected. What happens now? Saad asked. Adewale looked at his mother, then back at Saad. Now I go back. Not to everything, but to enough. The business needs to be protected. There are things only I can do. And me? Saad asked. Adewale looked at her directly. You fill in your polytechnic application. You study law. And you use whatever resources are now available to you to become exactly who you told me you wanted to become. He paused. I am not rescuing you, Saad. You were never someone who needed rescuing. I am simply removing the obstacles. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached into her pocket and unfolded the application form on the table between them. Help me fill this in, she said. He sat down across from her. They filled it in together. The news broke in the way that news in a small city always breaks. Suddenly, completely, and without mercy for anyone caught on the wrong side of it. It began with a brief item in a Lagos business publication. A short paragraph noting that Adewale Ogundamu, chairman of Ogundamu Holdings, had ended his voluntary absence from public life and would be resuming active leadership of the company. Accompanying the paragraph was a photograph. Adewale in a meeting room, no longer in his faded compound clothes, but in a well-fitted dark suit, seated at the head of a long table. He looked exactly like what he was. The photograph made that impossible to miss. The item was shared on social media. Someone connected the name to Abeokuta. Someone else said they had heard he had been living near Kudo Market. Another person said they had seen him reading a newspaper by the motor park many times and thought nothing of it. Then someone made the connection that sent it everywhere. He got married. A month ago. A quiet ceremony in a compound in Abeokuta. His wife is a teenage orphan. The story exploded. In the market where Auntie Remy sold her goods, she heard about it from 3 different women before 8 o'clock in the morning. She sat behind her stall with her hands folded in her lap and said nothing for a very long time. By midday, the questions had started. A woman who bought tomatoes from her every week stopped and looked at her differently. Was that not the girl you people married off? She asked. The child who used to fetch water before sunrise? Auntie Remy said yes. The woman shook her head slowly and walked away without buying anything. Another trader 2 stalls down called across to her. Remy, so your husband is the one who gave away Ogundamu's wife like spare change? Laughter from the surrounding stalls, but not the kind that included her. Auntie Remy straightened her tomatoes and said nothing. There was nothing she could say that would not make it worse. Uncle Cunnel heard it on the radio while eating breakfast. He sat with his spoon halfway to his mouth and did not finish his meal. The relatives who had laughed in the compound on the wedding day found themselves in conversations they had not anticipated. They had things to explain. The explanations were not easy. In Madame Adeyemi's classroom, one of the students came in and said, Teacher, did you hear about that man who was a beggar and turned out to be a billionaire who married one of our former students? Madame Adeyemi set down her chalk. She looked out the window. She felt something in her chest that was equal parts vindication and emotion. I knew that girl, she said quietly. I knew she was meant for more than what they gave her. Funmaleo, the woman who had expected to marry Adewale's name and balance sheet, released a statement through a publicist that nobody believed and everyone discussed. She disappeared from the social circles where she had been prominent and was replaced in conversations by a 17-year-old girl from a Face Me I Face You compound whose name people were only just learning. Saad Bello Ogundamu. Uncle Cunnel came to the house. He came without calling, without warning, with his hat in his hand in a way he had never held it before. He stood at the entrance of the now properly secured residence that Adewale had moved them into and asked to see Saad. She received him in the sitting room. She sat in a chair across from him. She was wearing plain clothes. She had her land law textbook on the table beside her. She was enrolled in the evening school program. She had been studying for 3 days. Uncle Cunnel looked at the room, at the furniture, at the textbook, at Sod. She gave him enough time to feel the full weight of the silence. Then she said, "What do you want, Uncle?" He began to speak. He talked about family. About how he'd raised her when no one else would. About how he had done his best with what he had. About how surely she could not blame him for the circumstances, and how surely family must forgive family. And how surely now that things were going well for her, she could see her way to helping him with a small matter of his business which was struggling, and Sod let him finish. Then she said, "The land in the village. My parents' land. It is mine. It has already been transferred. You will not be pursuing any claim to it." Uncle Cunnel's mouth opened. "Whatever help my parents' land would have given you," Sod continued, "you forfeited when you arranged to sell me to what you thought was a beggar." She looked at him steadily. "I forgive you. But I will not finance you." Uncle Cunnel sat with that. "You can see yourself out," Sod said. She picked up her textbook. He left. 2 days later, Sod and Adewale drove through the Kudo market area on their way to meet the lawyer handling the land documentation. The car was clean and quiet and clearly not the kind of car that stopped in that neighborhood. People looked. At the junction near the motor park, a group of women recognized her. One of them had been at the wedding compound. She was the one who had leaned to her neighbor and whispered loudest. She saw Sod in the passenger seat and went still. Sod saw her too. Their eyes met through the car window for a full second. Sod did not look away. She did not smile. She simply held the woman's gaze with the same composed stillness she had stood with on the morning of the wedding. Then the car moved on. Adewale had seen the exchange. He said nothing. He did not need to. Sod looked forward at the road ahead and adjusted the land documents on her lap. The legal work on her parents' land was completed 4 weeks later. The title was registered in Sod Bello Ogundamo's name. Her parents had owned half a hectare of land in a village outside Abeokuta. On the day the documents were finalized, Sod took them and sat quietly in the room where she and Adewale had first talked across the small table. She looked at the documents for a long time. Then she looked around the room. The cement floor. The metal louve window. The small table. None of these things were here anymore. They had moved. Adewale's resources had made that possible, but she kept the image of the room clearly in her mind. Because the room was where she had made her first free decision. The decision to fill in the application form. The decision to study law. The decision to stay. She had made those decisions in a small room with nothing. They were the same decisions regardless of what had come after. The wealth had changed her circumstances. It had not changed the decisions. And the decisions were the things she was most proud of. Adewale returned from Lagos on a Thursday evening. She met him at the door with the land documents in her hand. He looked at them. Then at her. "It is done," she said. He nodded slowly. She looked at him. "I want to go to the village," she said. "When I am ready. I want to stand on that land." "We will go," he said. She gave a small nod. Then she went back to her textbooks. He watched her for a moment from the doorway. He had spent 3 years watching people. In those 3 years, he had never met anyone who absorbed a change in circumstances and returned immediately to the work at hand the way Sod Bello did. He thought about the girl he had seen at the motor park, adjusting the books under her arm after the motorcycle soaked her uniform, and continuing to walk. She had not changed. The world around her had changed. But she had not. He went inside and made tea. In the months that followed, 2 lives rebuilt themselves in parallel. Adewale returned to Ogundamo Holdings with the calm authority of a man who had spent 3 years learning what he had been doing wrong. The board that Funmaleo had been moving through quietly discovered that the chairman had not lost his ability to make decisions. He had simply sharpened it. The company stabilized. New contracts followed. A real estate development in Ibadan and a logistics partnership in Port Harcourt came together within the first quarter. He no longer lived in the Face Me I Face You compound. But he kept the habit of reading the newspaper every morning before any screen was turned on. He kept the habit of stillness that the 3 years had given him. He kept the habit of listening before speaking, which was the most valuable thing the broken sandals had taught him. He also kept his word. Sod entered the evening law program and did not leave the top of her class. She studied the way she had always studied, with the hunger of someone who understood that knowledge was the only territory no one could take from you. By the end of the first term, her lecturer had already written a note to the Polytechnic registrar about her. By the end of the first year, she had been referred to the university direct entry program. She studied land law and property rights. She understood, from her own history, the specific cruelty of property stolen through legal language. She intended to understand that language well enough to fight it. Madame Adeyemi visited once a month. She sat with Saad over tea and they talked about cases, about legislation, about the gap between what the law said and what the law did. Madame Adeyemi brought her newspaper clippings. Saad debated them with a sharpness that made her old teacher smile. "I told you," Madame Adeyemi said one afternoon. "I told you this place would not swallow you." "You told me not to let it," Saad replied. "There is a difference." Madame Adeyemi laughed. "Yes," she said. "There is." One Saturday morning, Saad and Adewale drove to the village outside Abeokuta. The land was there, exactly as the documents described it. Half a hectare on a gentle slope, some of it overgrown, some of it still clear. A mango tree at the far corner that Saad did not remember, but must have been there when her parents were alive. She stood on the edge of the land for a long time without speaking. She thought about her father carrying her out through the window of a burning house. She thought about her mother's voice singing on Saturday mornings. She thought about 11 years old and everything that came after. The mat on the floor. The well water before dawn. The textbooks she had kept reading even when reading felt like the only act of defiance left to her. She thought about a man in broken sandals sitting on a stool near a compound gate, looking at her in a way that took her seriously before he had any reason to. She crouched down and pressed her palm flat against the soil. It was her parents' earth. It smelled like rain and roots and something older than any of the things that had happened to her. She stood up. She turned to Adewale. He was standing a few steps behind her, giving her the space she needed. She walked to him. "Thank you," she said. He shook his head slightly. "You would have found this eventually," he said. "On your own terms." "Maybe," she said. "But not today." He looked at the land. The mango tree was visible at the far end, its branches wide and unhurried. They stood side by side on her parents' soil as the morning moved around them. Birds crossed the open sky. The land was quiet and patient, and entirely hers. What this story leaves us is not a lesson about wealth. Wealth came into this story late, and it was never the point. The point is Saad Bello at 17 years old, standing in the middle of a mocking compound with her chin slightly lifted, asking not "will you save me," but simply, "when?" The point is a girl who had been given every reason to stop reading, stop thinking, stop wanting, and who kept doing all three, quietly, in whatever corner of the world she was placed in. The point is that the people who tried to make her invisible handed her to a man whose entire project was learning to see. Sometimes the worst decision someone makes for you becomes the best thing that ever happened to you. Not because suffering is good. It is not. But because who you choose to be inside the suffering is something no one can arrange or arrange away. Saad was not rescued. She was already who she needed to be. She simply finally had room to become it. If this story moved something in you, tell us in the comments. Have you ever been in a situation where what looked like the worst outcome turned out to open a door you never expected? Tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe in stories that see people clearly, please subscribe to Visa's Tales. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded today that being underestimated is not the same as being defeated. Because the world will always underestimate the quiet ones. Right up until it cannot.